I'm delighted to be a part of this program. It's very, very exciting. So for those of you that don't know where Nottingham is, you've probably heard of it in connection to Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood. You know, it's in the middle of the UK, and that's where I live. So I'm a member for the of the Centre for Mathematical Medicine and Biology. But today I'm going to talk about work that it started quite a while ago, and it's to do with so-called rebound currents. So I'll give you an example of what they are shortly. But you know, they're found all over the brain. I've said here they're found in, you know, deep cerebellar nuclei and elsewhere. But I think many of us think of rebound phenomena as arising in the thalamus with slow T-type calcium currents, and again in medial enthorinal cortex via the so-called IH current mediated by HCN channels. So these are the two types of currents that essentially I'm going to cover today. Hopefully you can see me wiggling my mouse around, but to give you an idea of what I mean by rebound, let's look at this very simple caricature here. A cell at rest, nice voltage, and then it's hyperpolarized. During this hyperpolarization, some current builds up. When you're released from inhibition or the inhibition is released, the cell can feel that current and generate in response a packet of spikes, a burst, and then it will relax back to its natural resting state. So that's the sort of rebound phenomena I want to talk about. You know, responses in sense after inhibitory signals. And I'm much more interested in the patterns that emerge at the network level than I am really in the bursting patterns themselves. So why might we be interested in networks? Well, of course, one very important network is the thalamus, you know, the sensory gateway to the cortex. Many people, I see John Rinzel's here, have studied these sorts of systems, building networks of thalamocortical cells, talking to reticular cells. The thalamocortical cells can rebound burst. They relay signals to the reticular layer that send an inhibitory signal back. So we might want to think about building models of thalamocortical cells with effective inhibitory signals. And the model I'm going to start talking about it is a very, very simple one, a model that just makes spikes with the addition of a little extra current that allows the rebound to happen. And this has been called now the integrated fine burst model. There's a very nice development of this by Greg Smith and John Rinzel and Murray Sherman. But essentially, it's a very low dimensional model that makes bursts. And the idea would be, given it's a cheap computational model, cheap analytically too, maybe we could study it networks and begin to ask questions about the sorts of things you might see, for example, in thalamic slices, like the propagation of waves and why their speed is somehow an order of magnitude slower than the sort of waves you might see in cortex. What is it about these ionic currents that give rise to interesting patterns? Okay, so spikes are pretty to deal actually in so I'm going to start with a fundamental approach. Equation at the top is motivated, if you like, by an integrated fine bit of decay, a little bit of input. This is some sort of shunt and some conductance change, and the extra bells and whistles coming from the slow T-type calcium current here. G is a conductance just fixed. H is going to be a gating variable that won't always be felt in neurons. This side here is a switch that allows you to feel the rebound current. And if you're above this magic value VH, you feel the current, and if you're below, you don't. And what does this H do? Well, it just decays to rest, or it gets pushed up to 1. So, you know, populations of channels open and closed, depending upon whether you're above or below the magic threshold. So a little cartoon here to give you some sort of orientation. So imagine you're sending in a nice periodic signal into one of these integrated fine burst neurons, and you hyperpolarize it. So down here, you're below VH, so the rebound current builds up, but you don't feel it. And then the inhibition, it wears off, or you're released, and you become sensitive to the IH current, which could be quite strong by now because you were hyperpolarized for quite a while. That current then drives you to create spikes in a burst, but at the same time, the channels are shutting down. I mean, the current is wearing off, and that terminates the burst. So a little very simple model that makes a little burst or packet of spikes. Okay, so let's think about a cheap version of this that would allow us to do some network studies. So if you go back to thinking about integrating fire models, it's very, very easy to think about constructing the firing rate of an integrating fire model in response to constant drive. So basically, if you look at this cartoon, the integrating fire process state, but the reset mechanism gets in the way, and that allows you to create a nice rhythmic periodic signal from a one-dimensional in low-dimensional ODE system. And the bigger the steady state value, the more frequent the spikes will be. Okay, and it's very easy to write down the firing rate response for one of these simple neurons in response to constant input, or in this case, in response to the steady state that you're trying to reach. And you know, if you've seen these sorts of formulas before, they're no surprise. Maybe I can include some sort of refractory timescale to limit or saturate the firing rate. But what I'm going to do is say that the firing rate is a function of the steady state that you're trying to reach. But of course, for this model, if you look at the steady state of this model, it's actually going to feel not only the intrinsic membrane properties, but it's going to feel the gating dynamics. So the steady state is in fact a function of the drive, which can be synaptic, and the gating variables. And this little indicator here just tells me, am I feeling the drive? You know, am I above VH or am I below? It's a little switch. And looking ahead to making life really easy, if the firing rate is dominated by the refractory process, I can just say, well, the firing rate is just, you know, you're firing as much as you can at a time scale determined by the refractoriness, and that only happens if your voltage is bigger than the firing threshold. It's a very, very simple firing rate model, and you can relax that assumption to go back to smooth versions. But the idea is that this single neuron perspective will allow us to build a network using this firing rate. So what do I mean by that? So typically in a network like this, I could imagine a bunch of cells, could be Hodgkin-Huxley or integrating fire or integrating fire and burst. They make spikes that are sent to impinge upon synaptic contact points, bond strengths between nodes I and J, Wij, and the spikes are filtered by some sort of temporal filter with this symbol here, this eta asterisk, a nice temporal convolution. So the job of the nodes is to generate spike times. So the Jth node will have a set of events, firing times, that will create a set of conductances with these sorts of shapes, and I can construct a drive. I can write, let me rewrite this in this sort of convoluted form to expose some delta Dirac functions. And you can think of these delta Diracs here as spike train. And the filter shapes, you know, just draw down from many sources in computation neuroscience. The filters just go up and come down, representing postsynaptic responses to the arrival of an action potential. All the biology of the synapse is subsumed in this shape eta. And eta, I'm going to use the Green's function of some linear differential operator Q. Here's a second example. And again, for those of you who know your mathematical physics history, George Green was the miller in the town of Nottingham a few hundred years ago. So it's nice to make a link to the sort of machinery he's developed and use it today. Okay, so how do I build the rate model? Well, I can get rid of this filter by applying this differential operator. So I'd have Q acting on my drive, is something driven by spikes. And all I do is say, well, if I cross my fingers, maybe I can wash away the spikes with something that I'm going to call the rate. So this F will be the rate. It will replace this spike train. And I'm going to close my equations by saying that the firing rate is a function of the steady state that the underlying cell is trying to reach, modulo the exclusion of all the spiking currents. So these equations are sort of ubiquitous in our community, and they're often closed by saying the firing rate is a function of drive. So you might put a U here, study those equations. So very, very similar. Just a small tweak, this V not only feels U, but it feels H. So all the gating dynamics are hidden in the functional form you choose for this steady state. Okay. What does the model do? So let me just show you some pretty pictures, some eye candy, some patterns. And it's nice to see these patterns in the plane. So I'm going to stretch out this model. from a node to a network, and I'm going to go for a nice continuum description. So that's what this symbol here means. I'm going to stretch out my interactions of a spatial convolution. And sometimes, it's conveniently numerically and analytically not to go to the steady state of the underlying V variable, but just to introduce a small parameter here and keep the V dynamics, but make sure it's very, very fast with respect to all the other currents in the model. So the firing rate model I'm going to talk about will hopefully be useful if all the drives, all the synapses are slow, and all the fancy ionic currents, like the slow T-type calcium current, are also slow. And I guess the clue's in the name. It's called a slow T-type calcium current, so we're probably on safe territory. So these are planar systems, and I've chosen a kernel which is purely inhibitory. So there's no excitation in this little toy simulation. All the neurons are wired to each other. Maybe there's some spatial structure, but there's purely inhibitory connections. And really, that means we're relying on the rebound phenomena to create firing. Rebound arises after inhibition. So in this picture on the left, you see some hexagonal structures propagating down the page. So a nice regular structure here. And on the right, something with a spatial structure. This is seeded from some local region of inhibition, and then a pattern grows and develops. So you can get a nice pattern. The question is, what might they be useful for? And maybe we'll come back to that right at the very, very end. But what I want to do as an applied mathematician is get a feel for where the patterns come from. How can I describe them? How can I understand them? How can I organize them? So I'm going to talk about a system which is built from a voltage variable, a gating variable, and some synapses, which are second order. So I need a couple of equations for my synapse. And study the low-lying fruit first. I'm going to assume there's a ball solution, which is one where the tissue just oscillates homogeneously everywhere, but there's a nice rhythm. So I'm going to look for a periodic solution. I'll call period big delta. If you haven't met me before, I'll guess what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to basically talk about the use of piecewise linear systems. I've deliberately constructed this model so that everywhere I look in phase space, I've essentially got a linear dynamical system. And I can use everything I actually learned at school when I was about 18 to study this system. Okay, so all my state variables evolve according to some sort of matrix vector system, where J here is a 4x4 matrix, but I know what it is. Okay, and I is some sort of drive, but it will allow me to ponder the construction of periodic orbits. So here's a projection into voltage and gate. So in this example, if I start here, I'm going to head up to threshold. I'm feeling the rebound current. It pushes me beyond threshold. I start driving other bits of the tissue and I inhibit them. And then the drive wears off and I come down through the magic threshold VH. At this point, the rebound current is allowed to build up. The H variable comes up. I don't feel it until I'm released from inhibition. I cross VH and I feel the drive from the rebound, pushes me up to threshold. I go on and so on and so forth. So very, very simple construction of a periodic orbit. I've got some labels here, but basically to construct these orbits, you just need to sort of guess the shape of this and demand self-consistently. You cross through the firing threshold a couple of times and you cross through the rebound threshold a couple of times and join everything up. So it becomes sort of quite an ugly sort of patchy gluing together sort of approach to constructing orbits, and nonetheless, it works. But you just have to self-consistently solve trajectories crossing various thresholds. Then you need the time of these events, the time I do this, time I do this, and here there's 4, and then each times going from one region to another, trajectories, and then solve all the times of flight. So perhaps inelegant, but doable. And then you might ask, you've got orbit, nothing like pretty pictures in the simulations. Wouldn't it be great if it went unstable and then seeded those? Great. So I was just saying that construction is easy. Stability for these systems is not, because there's various switches. You need to know when you switch through VH and when you switch through V theta, the firing threshold. So let me give you a little introduction for how to do linear stability for so-called non-smooth systems. And I know this is not an integrate and fire model, but the technique works equally well for integrate and fire as things with switches like Heavisides. And this might just be, have more context for most of the audience. So imagine a really simple integrate and fire. V dot is minus V plus some drive. Blue curve is the lovely periodic orbit you would expect. And what I'm going to do is perturb it with this green wiggly thing. So the green wiggly thing is a perturbed orbit. And if you see hats on, that means perturbation. So I've got some unperturbed event times, firing times, and perturbed firing times. And I'm interested in the deviation between them. So I can either think in terms of firing maps, or I can, which is really a event-based description, or I can think in terms of differences between the trajectories, a flow-based description. And a nice way to study this is with the use of indicator functions. An indicator function just tells me how to define firing time in terms of the voltage. And the way I do that is to say, when the voltage crosses threshold, that's my event time. So it seems a bit weird to introduce this indicator function machinery. You'll see it's useful in a minute. And so the same definition holds for the perturbed trajectory at the perturbed firing times. These things both equal 0. And if the blue objects are close to the green objects, you can do a little bit of Taylor series expansion and relate this time here, this deviation in time, to this deviation in state. And they're just proportional, and they depend upon the velocity of the periodic orbit, the unperturbed orbit, just before the event. You can also ask the question, the perturbation here, just after this mess of firing, how does it relate to the perturbation here? How do I jump across the only non-smooth dynamics in the system? Again, Taylor series expansions help you. You can expand the deviation here in terms of the deviation before the event, in terms of these differences in the velocities after the event. This green curve here, this is the velocity of the perturbed trajectory just after an event. And the natural approximation is to say that this velocity here is roughly the same as the velocity here. It's definitely way different to the velocity down here. And just making that approximation and using delta t, what you see is this thing is a version of this perturbation by a jump. So I just need the ratio of the velocities before and after to work out how to propagate perturbations. And if there are no jump, before and after the same, and it looked like a T. So this is, it tells you how to switch operation. Work. Perturbation at naught in this integrate and fire model. Propagate it through one period. It's a linear system, got a nice propagate. Then I apply the Saltation rule, and I've got really simple rules of V dot before and after. V dot is just minus V plus I. So I've got no voltage before and threshold afterwards. And this object is conveniently the reciprocal of this one, so you just get 1. So this tells you that the Floquet multiplier for this system is 1. You can perturb the system, it may advance or retard the spike, but you just end up back on the orbit. Okay, you can't go anywhere else. Not surprisingly, it's a one-dimensional system, albeit with the nonlinearity, the non-smooth reset. So what we do is basically use this machinery to study our system. It hasn't got reset, but it has got switches. The added complication is that our system is spatially extended. So I'm going to consider perturbations of the state vector that separate in space and time. So some nice pattern in time, cos kx, and something in time that I can propagate around using linear rules. And every time I meet something nasty like a switch, I just use the Saltation rule. What is the Saltation rule? Well, these z's are now vectors. So this is a Saltation matrix. And again, if you've never seen this before, these sorts of things are ubiquitous in the non-smooth dynamical systems community that study things that impact, balls that hit walls, etc. And all you need to do is specify the indicator function and the rule that you apply at reset. You know, what happens when you fire, etc. Okay. And if you want to read more about this, rather than you at the very dense non-smooth dynamical systems literature, maybe have a look in context our paper in PRE, where we apply it to networks of integrated fires neurons. So a reminder of the model, there's some leak, there's some synaptic input. There's a rebound current with a switch. That's the non-smooth bit. There's a second order synapse, 2 equations here, with a filter such that 1 upon alpha is the time to peak of the filter. On non-local drive that sees the firing rate as a function of V. So this V feels the H, and the H has its own natural dynamics. And this H infinity here just happens to flip between 0 and 1. You could smooth it out if you like, but we're going to exploit switches ad infinitum in this little bit of the talk. This F, to make my life really easy, it's just going to be on or off. So you're either firing at the refractory timescale or you're not. So you just need to know, are you above or below V theta? You work out the Saltation rule, and then you're good to go. It doesn't really matter too much what the Saltation rule is, but you see it involves knowing the differences before and after events, velocities after the plus and velocities before, except this is to do with this non-local challenge. And this entry here is nothing more than the Fourier transform of this kernel, the shape of your Saltation rule. What can we do with it? Well, it means I can consider some initial perturbation, propagate it around the orbit, and I'll do the perturbations after one period get bigger or smaller. So the idea is you propagate with a matrix exponential, you saltate. That's one piece of the orbit. There's 4 propagate, saltate, you do times, and then you're interested in eigenvalues of this thing. Because if the eigenvalues of this thing all live in the unit disk, then your synchronous orbit is stable. But if any of them sneak out, you get an instability. And there's still 3 interesting ways you can leave the disk. 2 of them on the real axis, so you leave it +1 or -1. And the other one is where you leave, at an angle to the real line. A typical sort of lambda as a function of k, your sort of continuous spectrum that you might be familiar with in pattern forming systems, might look something like this. So in this example, lambda, here lambda's left the unit disk this way. Here it's just sneaking down below -1 this way. So this would flag up an instability. You can also leave the disk via the Naimark-Saka route. This is what this is called. Okay, so here's a little simulation corresponding to the theory that predicts an instability via this route, the Naimark-Saka route. So this is the space-time plot. We're not in 2D, one space, time going up. Lovely synchrony, lovely periodic rhythm, period delta. Then you start to see the emergence of a wave number k. And then things start to break up nicely in the sense that you see novel patterning. And you see the emergence of waves that there's no natural traveling wave frame, but things sort of jump across from right to left. And these have been termed lurching waves. I mean, of course, we're not the first to realize them. And I'm really, this work I'm talking about here is inspired by the original studies of John and Dave Terman and Xiaojing Wang and Bart Ementrout, and they're very, very nice science paper. And all we're doing is really showing that, rebound and inhibitory networks, unsurprisingly, does give rise to lovely lurching waves, but there's a sort of a dynamical systems perspective that allows you to organize, those sorts of patterns. Okay, this is an idealized model, but what we've done for synchrony, you can do for waves. There can be, we've seen lurching waves, but you can get lovely smooth waves, periodic traveling waves. You can compute things like the speed of the wave as a function of its period. There's 3 different dispersion curves here, different parameters, different synaptic timescales in the model. And when you see solid, a little bit of, again, linear stability analysis has indicated that these branches are stable. And when you see dashed, these pieces of the branches are unstable. There's quite a nice machinery for doing all this stability analysis. And we've tapped into that to develop the so-called Evans function approach. And I don't want to overwhelm you with that. I just say, if you're interested, there is a paper just about to appear in SciAds, but it's a nice machinery to use. Historically, it's been used for smooth systems. You just have to augment it with the non-smooth things. So once again, these saltation operators really, save the day, as it were, to allow you to determine stability of periodic waves. Okay, so this model I've talked about, it's a caricature. Every I've seen made a piecewise constant caricature. Can we do analysis of the model with space? And the answer is yes. But I'm going to switch modeling now. Instead to talk about slow T-type calcium currents, I'm going to talk about the IH current that is manifest in many systems, including medial and enthorinal cortex. And of course, that's on many people's radar now because it seems to be the home of the story for grid cells. And I've been very inspired by reading papers by Michael Hasimo on the fact that grid cell firing properties do seem to correspond in densities of HCN channels. So as you move across the dorsal ventral axis of the MEC, there's a known change in the firing field scale of grid cells. So grid cells, things like as animal runs across a lattice in an environment can change from, say, centimeters to meters. There's been some very, very nice theory developed in this territory. Early on in this program, we had talks on the attractor models for grid cell firing. And again, it's been really, really nice to go back and revisit the work of essentially of Jeroen Barak and Ilya Fiat, and also the work of Fitz and Turetsky. And it says spin glass in this title, and that's where I did my piece, spin glass models, a long, long time ago. But the attractor models for grid cell firing patterns don't usually pay attention to any fancy ionic currents. There's no IH, but we know there's IH in the biology, and we know there's plenty of inhibition in MEC. So how do they work? Well, you have some sort of standard attractor model. I've written it in the space. You can put it back in your lattice, like a hot field net. You include a little bit of asymmetry in the kernels, in the interacts. And what that can allow is, if you choose the right kernel, you can get a lovely hexagonal structure forming in the tissue, in the space of, where this tissue is. And an internal drive that has some sort of head direction information can couple to that asymmetry in the kernel and cause the blobs of activity in the tissue to be dragged around. So on the left, there's a synthetic agent, or in fact a real apple, running around. That's the cot. It's got some head direction, and the direction of the animal is inherited by the direction of movement of the pattern. So you basically sort of think of this as you pin an electrode somewhere in the tissue. Every time a red blob runs over you, you fire, and that's how you might generate a grid cell firing pattern. Okay, so the models are very, very natural because they like to form patterns, okay? And they form patterns through the traditional mechanism that we've known about for a long, long time, since Alan Turing, and then through all the work of, well, many others, but I'm thinking of sort of the analysis that many of us have done on sort of Wilson-Cowan style models. You have a traditional neural field, you have a kernel that's short-range excitatory, long-range inhibitory. You fix to study the onset of pattern formation by linearizing around some sort of homogeneous steady state, very easy to construct. And you get an equation that describes the evolution of perturbations of the form e to the I k dot r, some sort of spatial pattern in the system. That is very easy to write down. Of interest, parameterized by the wave number of the pattern you're trying to destabilize, is basically proportional to the Fourier transform of the kernel. So if you're happy working in Fourier space, you draw a Fourier transform of a nice shape, you set your lambda equal to 0, and you just ask, when can that happen? Well, it's basically when your Fourier transform bumps into 1 upon f dashed. That gives you a nice bifurcation condition. How to pick the emergent pattern, because it's just determined by the peak of the Fourier transform. Okay, and that peak is obviously inherited from the choice of the kernel. So your wiring diagram has a scale, your Mexican hat has a scale. That determines a scale of patterning once you're beyond an instability. So the pattern here has a spatial scale determined by the wiring. It's not determined by any intrinsic the wiring pattern. Or just a little aside, you know, these models, if you just in the past have used them to make periodic patterns, there's no barrier to them making actually quasi-periodic patterns. So if you change the kernel for one that in the first space has 2 peaks, you can excite 2 different wave numbers. And if these are incommensurate, these can interact to give you lovely patterns that are quasi-periodic. Very unclear if the brain does this, but at least the models do it. And if you want to think, well, what would that look like back in real space? You invert this Fourier transform. It's just a, you know, a Mexican hat with some wobbles in the tail. So maybe not crazy, but you can get some nice, cool quasi patterns. But what I want to say is that these models, they're for patterning, but the spatial scale of the pattern is hardwired. So how do you get a variation across the axis of MEC? Do you really expect the system to rewire? Or maybe it can make use of the fancy ionic currents to get different scales of patterning. So that's obviously what I'm advocating for. So the model, which is a spiking model, is going to be an integrated fire model with an H current. So all the usual suspects, decay, synaptic input, maybe you have head direction input, but we've got a current here that just has a gating variable, very, very simple current with a strength. And the gating variable is going to be one that, you know, likes to open channels when you hyperpolarize and shut them when you depolarize. And we're going to consider a model with pure inhibition. So all the patterning, all the firing relies upon rebound. And the synaptic current is going to be generated by event times, spiking times. Again, we'll keep our synaptic filters. And we'll keep kernels of this form, pure inhibition. Nothing more. And I'm not going to use the fancy mechanism of moving patterns around. I'll just drop any head direction input and drop any asymmetry in the network. Okay, so what do you see in 2D? So this is a 2-dimensional simulation. I might just drag it along. So everywhere in here, there's a density of integrate and fire and rebound neurons wired up with pure inhibition. I just kick the system off with a bit of central inhibition and let it go. So just let it go. And whoops, something starts to develop. You just advance forward a little bit. Hopefully you can see the emergence of some pattern. It's got some nice spatial structure. It spreads throughout the domain. The structure seems to persist. If you squint a little bit, you might feel there's hexagons there, but it is quite dynamic. Unfortunately, the movie isn't playing so well. So there we go. So patterning without Mexican hat, pure inhibition, and the currents are doing a lot of essentially all the work. Okay, so again, as in the first part of the talk, how do we understand the mechanism of the patterning? Where do the scales come from? And it's challenging to do the analysis in 2D, although possible. So I'm just going to take the easy route and study a 1D system. And essentially, I'm going to look at waves propagating along a one-dimensional system and ask, can I at least understand the wavelength of those things? So what I'm thinking of is a system where there's a spike, then there's some refractoriness, so I clamp the system, then I feel inhibition hyperpolarizes me, the inhibition wears off, but my rebound current has been building up, I feel it, I make a single spike. So in contrast to IT, IH typically generates less spikes, and you repeat the process. So how do we construct an orbit? Well, again, no surprises. I jumped straight to the phase space. I've got V's and I've got gating variables. Last time it was H, now it's called N. And I just draw an orbit that I suspect exists. I fire here, I reset, I get clamped, I'm refractory, I'm inhibited, I'm hyperpolarized, that wears off. I come up through a magic threshold, I feel the current, makes me fire again, and so on and so forth. So you just have to determine the times of these events. When do you cross this threshold? When do you fire? When are you released from refractoriness? And you might fix that scale. So it's in some sense the same machinery. Everywhere in this space, I've got a piecewise linear dynamical system of the type here. It's events now. It's not state-dependent interactions. It's an event-driven thing. I can do as I did before. I can go to traveling waveframes. I can look for stationary solutions. I can work out the drive in these traveling waveframes. You know, there's a process, there's a machinery. I can borrow all that from smooth dynamical systems. I just have to worry about what to do when I fire and I refract and I switch. So there are 3 different types of events, all the same idea. Last time I had propagation by matrix exponentials. I exactly have that again here. I need a new class of Saltation rules because I've got 3 different types of thing, non-smoothness. It's exactly the same formula. You can write down the relevant indicator functions and the rules, not for resetting now, but the rules to take you through the events, and off you go. And I'm going to cut a long story short by just saying, for example, you can determine the stability of these waves in this one-dimensional system. These are smoothly propagating waves. And this diagram here is really some sort of representation of the Evans function, but where you see green dots, it's just telling you the relevant eigenvalues for the linear stability of the periodic wave. So in this example, the green dots, 2 of them, this conjugate pair, live in the right-hand complex plane. So whatever I've done, I've set up parameters and constructed a wave that will be predicted to be unstable. So here's the summary diagram. Speed of wave as a function of period. And I'm just doing 2 different studies. One where the membrane time, the time scale for the IH current is 400 milliseconds, and one where it's 800 milliseconds. So I'm just changing it. And what you see is when the time scale is long, you get a wide range of periods for which these waves are stable. And at this red dot here, this Evans function machinery tells you that this wave goes unstable. When you change the time scale, you control a lot the window of spatial scales or wave scales that can be supported. So just simply by changing a local property of the tissue, you know, the membrane, or this, sorry, not the membrane, this time constant, I can control the patterns. So maybe this is another way to think about the role of ionic currents. Maybe they give you local control of global patterns, which might be useful. So if you want a certain pattern scale, you don't go and rewire your network, you just overexpress HCN channels or underexpress them or change them somehow. So this axis here that Hassamo has talked about, which does correlate with the density of HCN channels, maybe it can be understood in terms of pattern formation, but not through the historically used attractor networks, but through these ones that just, you know, appreciate these currents exist. So the upshot is, I mean, I think, you know, maybe this is the thing we can talk about. We've all, for many years, and me in particular, have studied Hopfield style, Wilson-Cowan style networks to death. And we've used, you know, bump attractors seem to be very pervasive. Periodic patterning is now pervasive for the grid cell story. Maybe there's other dynamical things, patterns that can be used in neural computation that benefit from the inclusion of the nonlinear ionic currents. I've just talked about 2 of them here of the rebound type, but we know, of course, there's the classic zoo of ionic currents that we should be interested in. Okay, so the team, the work on the spiking model was done with Kyle and Maita and Ruben. Kyle is now in Exeter. Maita wasn't good. She's moving to somewhere in the States. And I think, in fact, we're sort of clash at the moment with the ICMNS conference. So I know Kyle is actually, I think, running a session there right now. And then the more recent work on the thalamic currents is done with Rudiger and Yiming. And all the heavy lifting on that has been done by Sunil. And there's a paper just come out, shortly to appear in SciAds. And if you would like a copy, of course, ask. And then the JMN is open access, so no problem reading that one. And I think that's probably a good time for me to shut up.